The Mediterranean, 17th century. On a war galley, dozens of men were chained to the oars, their sweat mixing with blood and salt water. Amid the crack of the whip and the roar of the sea, Cara Mehmed rose, struck down his overseer, and turned a floating prison into a banner of freedom. The Mediterranean in the 17th century was not only a crossroads of trade and empire, but also a graveyard for the forgotten. Among the most feared instruments of this world were the war galleys, long, narrow vessels driven forward by rows of oars. To outsiders they seemed powerful, sleek machines of war, but for those chained beneath the deck they were nothing more than floating prisons. Each galley required hundreds of men to keep the massive oars moving. These men were not volunteers. Most were captives, condemned criminals, or enslaved laborers pressed into service by force. Their lives were measured in strokes of the oar. Shackled 2 by 2 to wooden benches, their backs bent, they rowed through storms, through blazing sun, through the endless nights where the sea swallowed every trace of hope. The air below deck was heavy with rot and sweat, the stench of unwashed bodies mixed with damp wood and salt. A single bucket of foul water was passed along the row, shared by dozens. Food was hard bread or stale beans, enough to keep a man alive, but never enough to restore strength. Overseers stood above with whips and clubs, ready to punish even the smallest falter. To fall behind was to invite lashes that ripped skin to bone. Death was constant. A man who collapsed at his oar was unshackled only after his last breath, his body dragged across the deck and tossed into the sea like refuse. Within minutes, another captive was forced into the vacant seat, and the rhythm of the oars never broke. Among these men sat Cara Mehmed. His arms were wiry, his back scarred from countless strikes of the whip. Each pull of the oar cut deeper into his palms, where thick calluses had hardened into a second skin. But what set him apart was not his body, it was the fire inside him. Where others sank into silence, Mehmed stared at the horizon with eyes that refused to yield. Every night, chained in the suffocating dark, he dreamed not only of escape, but of turning this very prison into a weapon against its masters. The galley was designed to break men, to crush their spirits until they were nothing more than machines of flesh. But for Mehmed, each stroke of the oar only sharpened his resolve. He understood what many feared to admit. Unless he acted, the sea would one day claim him like all the others. Day after day, the rhythm of suffering was the same. At dawn, the overseer's whistle shrieked through the hold. Men were forced awake, their legs still chained to the benches, their bodies stiff from cold and exhaustion. The first command was always the same: row. And so the cycle of torment began again. Under the lash of leather, the men rowed until sweat blurred their vision. Bread hardened to stone was tossed down as rations. The water was brackish, drawn from barrels that had sat for months in the Sunday. Bellies swelled with sickness, mouths cracked with thirst. And still the oars had to move, for the galley was relentless. The sea itself became both torment and grave. When storms rose, waves crashed over the deck, drenching the rowers below. They could not escape, they could not flee. Chains kept them tethered to their fate. Many drowned where they sat, lungs filling as seawater poured into the hold. Others starved slowly, their bodies wasting away while still being forced to row. Every man knew that death was waiting. Corpses were dragged by their ankles and tossed into the deep without prayer or pause. No names, no markers, only the brief splash of a body swallowed by the waves. The bench was quickly filled again, as though life itself were no more than a broken link in an endless chain. Cara Mehmed endured it all. He felt the crack of whips against his back until his flesh grew numb. He watched men beside him wither and die, replaced without a word. He listened to their last breaths fade into silence, and through it all, he carried a truth sharper than any blade. Survival meant more than enduring. He knew that if he did not rise, he would vanish in the same silence that claimed so many before him. His name would never be spoken, his body never buried. That was the final cruelty of the galley. It did not simply kill men, it erased them. And so, deep within the suffocating dark, Mehmed's resolve hardened. He would not allow the sea to consume him in silence. If death was inevitable, then he would meet it standing, not chained. He began to watch the overseers more closely, noting their routines, their weaknesses. Among the men chained beside him, he whispered in hushed tones, planting seeds of rebellion. It was not yet a plan, only the spark of one, but even a spark could grow, and on the endless sea, where hope was scarce as fresh water, that spark was everything. The days bled together, each indistinguishable from the last. Yet Cara Mehmed's eyes remained sharp. He studied every movement of the overseers. When they descended into the rowers' pit, some carried whips, others small blades for cutting ropes or chains. He noticed which ones were careless, which ones lingered too long near the benches, and which ones trusted their power too much to suspect danger. Every detail mattered. At night, when exhaustion forced most men into restless slumber, Kamemed whispered to those beside him. At first, the whispers were met with silence or fearful glances. Rebellion was unthinkable. The galley was their cage, and the sea was their executioner. Yet slowly, piece by piece, his determination infected others. He spoke not of impossible dreams, but of survival. "Would you rather die nameless at this oar," he asked softly, "or die fighting with your hands free?" A small circle began to form. They learned to communicate in looks and gestures, passing along signals when the guard's attention wavered. Tools became their lifeline. A bent nail hidden in cloth, a shard of metal pried from the deck. A chain link worked loose through weeks of quiet effort. To the overseers, these scraps were meaningless. To Kamemed and his companions, they were weapons. The sea itself provided cover. During storms, when waves pounded the galley and thunder roared overhead, guards were less attentive. Whispers could pass unheard, plans could be refined. They mapped out the timing. The moment of attack would be when the ship was far from port, when fatigue dulled the vigilance of their captors. Their greatest weapon was not iron but surprise. Kamemed knew that the overseers, accustomed to obedience, would not expect their chained rowers to rise against them. It would take only a moment of hesitation, only one overseer falling, for chaos to spread like fire across the deck. Each night, as he lay shackled, Kamemed imagined the strike. The chains would not hold them forever. The galley, meant to crush the human spirit, would become their battlefield. He was no longer rowing simply to survive. He was rowing toward a moment when blood and freedom would meet on the open sea. The plan was set. All they needed now was courage and a spark to ignite it. Dawn broke across the horizon in streaks of pale red, the sea calm after a restless night. The galley groaned as men bent to the rhythm of their oars, their bodies already aching, their spirits already worn. Above them, an overseer's whip cracked sharply, its echo cutting through the morning air. It was then that Kamemed moved. When the lash came down again, he twisted, catching the overseer's arm and yanking him forward with all the force of years spent chained to the oar. The man stumbled, eyes wide with shock, and in that heartbeat of hesitation, Kamemed struck. A sharpened shard of metal, hidden for weeks, drove into the overseer's chest. The man collapsed, his whip falling uselessly to the deck. The spark had ignited. Chains rattled as other men surged up, wielding whatever they could seize broken nails, heavy chains, a hidden knife, cries of defiance mixed with shouts of alarm. The air filled with chaos. Overseers rushed to respond, but they were unprepared. For the first time, the rowers did not cower, they attacked. One man swung a length of chain with deadly precision, shattering a guard's jaw. Another seized a hammer meant for ship repairs, bringing it down again and again until blood stained the wood. The narrow pit below deck became a storm of bodies, a place where fear and fury collided. Kamemed led the charge. He fought not only with his hands but with his voice, urging the others forward. "Do not stop! Strike while we are free!" His words carried above the din, a rallying cry that drove the desperate into action. Above, the sun rose higher, casting the deck in stark light. Blood spattered against the planks, and the once ordered rhythm of the oars dissolved into chaos. Some rowers fell, cut down by blades or crushed in the struggle, but their sacrifice only deepened the resolve of those still standing. At last, silence fell. Overseers lay scattered, their bodies broken, their whips discarded. Chains clinked to the floor as men freed themselves and one another, their wrists raw but unbound. The galley had changed hands. What had been a floating prison was now a captured fortress. And as Kamemed stood on the deck, chest heaving, hands still slick with blood, he looked not at the corpses around him but at the endless horizon ahead. For the first time, the sea no longer seemed like a grave. It looked like freedom. The battle below deck was only the beginning. Once the overseers lay dead or dying, the men broke their chains in a frenzy. Some used the very keys they had torn from fallen guards, while others smashed shackles against iron bolts until the metal bent. One by one, wrists were freed, ankles pulled from their fetters, and bodies that had known nothing but captivity stood upright for the first time in years. Together, they surged upward toward the deck. Sunlight hit their eyes like fire, a reminder of how long they had been denied its warmth. The sailors above, alarmed by the noise, scrambled to respond. But they were unprepared for what met them: dozens of men armed with chains, hammers, knives, and the strength of desperation. Mehmed led from the front, his eyes locked on the officers barking orders near the mast. He knew that unless they seized command quickly, the sailors could regroup and overwhelm them. With a cry, he charged, his hammer smashing through the wooden railing as he advanced. Others followed, flooding the deck like a storm. The sailors fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. The freed rowers, driven by years of rage, struck with a ferocity that could not be matched. Knives found their mark, clubs cracked skulls, and the deck became a battlefield. Every corner echoed with the clash of struggle, every plank stained red with the memory of defiance. At last, the final officer fell, his sword slipping from lifeless fingers. The deck fell silent except for the heavy breathing of men who had never before breathed as free souls. The galley was theirs. The sea stretched in every direction, boundless and terrifying. But to the men who had lived their lives chained below, it was no longer a prison. It was a horizon, waiting to be claimed. Mehmed raised his hand and pointed toward the helm. "This ship belongs to us now," he declared, his voice, hoarse but unwavering, carried across the deck. "We row no longer for masters. We row for freedom." For the first time, the oars struck the water not under the lash, but under their own will. And as the galley surged forward, it felt as though the sea itself carried them toward a destiny that had never before been possible. The galley, once a symbol of oppression, now bore the marks of rebellion. Blood stained the planks, and broken chains littered the deck like relics of a past already fading. But within hours, the ship began to transform. Freed men took their places at the oars, not as slaves, but as brothers. The rhythm was no longer forced by the crack of whips. It was chosen, a heartbeat of defiance that echoed against the waves. Mehmed stood at the helm, the wind snapping his tattered shirt against his scarred back. For the first time, his hands gripped the wheel, and the horizon belonged to him. The ship creaked as it changed course, turning away from the roots of empire and toward the promise of safe harbors where chains held no power. They had no banner to raise, no official flag to claim their victory, yet in their hearts, the ship itself had become a flag. Every oar stroke was a declaration, every gust of wind in the sails a hymn of freedom. The galley was no longer a tool of war for their captors, it was a weapon of rebellion for those who had seized it. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, the men gathered on deck. Some laughed for the first time in years, others wept, the release of anguish too heavy to contain. They shared fragments of bread, a meal more sacred than any feast. No longer prisoners, they were brothers, bound by struggle. But beneath the joy, a shadow lingered. They knew their escape would not go unanswered. Somewhere beyond the horizon, their former masters would soon realize what had happened. Ships would be sent. Pursuit was inevitable. Still, Mehmed refused despair. Standing beneath the starlight, he spoke to the men. "They will come for us, yes, but let them come. We are no longer their slaves. This ship is proof that their power can be broken." His words carried like a vow, etching themselves into the night air. And so, as the galley cut through the waves, it was no longer a floating prison. It was a banner of rebellion, raised not on a mast but in the hearts of men who had chosen to fight rather than vanish in silence. The sea, once their enemy, had become their ally. Every wave carried them further from bondage and closer to freedom. Freedom came with a cruel price. It was never safe for long. Within days, the horizon darkened with sails not their own. Scouts aboard nearby ships had carried word of the uprising, and their captors wasted no time. A fleet was dispatched, armed with cannons, soldiers, and the fury of masters who could not tolerate defiance. From the deck of their stolen galley, Mehmed and his brothers first spotted the white crests of sails cutting through the dawn. Fear swept across the deck like a cold wind. These were not merchant ships. These were war vessels, faster, heavier, and determined. The men tightened their grip on the oars, their hands blistered but steady. Mehmed stood at the prow, his eyes locked on the distant threat. He knew the chase would be merciless. "Row!" he commanded, his voice like steel. "Row, as if your lives depend on it, because they do." The oars bit into the water, pulling the ship forward. Unlike before, there were no whips, no overseers screaming for rhythm. Instead, the men found their pace in unity, in the desperate will to outrun their hunters. Muscles strained, backs ached, but they rowed with a strength born of survival. The enemy ships closed in quickly. Their cannons thundered, sending iron balls crashing into the waves around the galley. Splashes rose like walls of water, soaking the rowers. The deck shook, timbers groaning under the impact. Yet the men did not falter. Every blast only deepened their resolve. Arrows hissed through the air, some striking wood, others piercing flesh. Cries of pain rang out, but still they rowed. Those too wounded to continue urged their brothers forward, refusing to let the rhythm die. The galley surged through the sea like a hunted beast, defiant in its struggle. The chase stretched into the night. Stars glittered overhead, indifferent witnesses to the battle below. Exhaustion gnawed at the men's limbs, but the thought of chains drove them harder than any whip ever could. For the first time, they were rowing not to serve but to survive free. And at the helm, Cara Mehmed refused to let despair enter his heart. The sea was vast, and within its chaos lay the possibility of escape. Whether through storm, darkness, or sacrifice, they would not return to bondage. The cannons roared again, and this time the iron struck true. A ball smashed into the stern, sending shards of wood flying. Men were thrown from their benches, some into the sea, where the waves swallowed them without mercy. The galley shuddered, but it did not stop. Mehmed fought to steady the helm, his hands slick with sweat and blood. Around him, chaos reigned. Arrows thudded into the deck, men screamed, and the sea itself seemed to tremble under the clash of wills. Yet amid the terror, something extraordinary burned, a refusal to yield. The pursuers closed in, grappling hooks thrown across the waves. With a cry, Mehmed ripped one free and hurled it back into the sea. Others followed, striking down soldiers who dared to leap aboard. The galley had become a fortress, its defenders fighting not for conquest, but for the simple right to breathe as free men. Blood slicked the deck. Men who had only just tasted freedom fell where they stood, their bodies joining the sea that had once been their prison. Some were captured, dragged onto enemy ships in chains, their cries echoing across the water. Others leapt into the waves willingly, choosing death over bondage. Mehmed fought until his body could give no more. His blade was nothing more than a stolen knife, but in his hands it was a symbol of defiance. He struck again and again, each blow a declaration that he would not live as property. At last, wounded and bleeding, he staggered to the center of the deck. Around him lay the broken remnants of his brothers. The galley burned, sails torn, its oars shattered. The enemy pressed closer, overwhelming in number. But Mehmed did not kneel. With blood dripping from his hands, he raised his knife one last time, his eyes blazing against the horizon. He would die as he had lived in his final days fighting. The sea roared louder than the cannons, waves crashing against the hull, as though the ocean itself recognized his defiance. And when Mehmed finally fell, it was not in chains, but with a weapon in his grasp and freedom in his heart. His body vanished into the tide, claimed by the same waters that had once imprisoned him. Yet his spirit remained, carried across the waves, a whisper of rebellion that no fleet could ever silence. When the smoke cleared and the sea returned to silence, the galley rebellion had been crushed. Many of the men who fought beside Cara Mehmed perished, their bodies swallowed by the tide. Others were dragged back into chains, paraded through harbors as examples of what awaited those who dared to defy their masters. On the surface, the uprising seemed only a fleeting storm, quickly extinguished by the might of empire. Yet stories travel faster than ships. In every Mediterranean port, whispers spread of the galley that turned against its overseers. Sailors spoke of a man named Mehmed, who rose from the benches of the condemned, struck down his oppressors, and commanded a vessel of war, even if only for a few days. These tales, carried by merchants and wanderers, refused to die. For masters and captains, the legend was a nightmare. If one man could rally the chain to rise, who was to say others would not follow? Fear rippled through the ranks of the oppressors, forcing them to tighten discipline, to watch more closely, to chain more harshly. But the very need for such measures betrayed the truth. The myth of Cara Mehmed had already cracked their illusion of control. For the enslaved, the legend was a spark of hope. In the darkness below decks, men whispered his name like a prayer. They imagined his defiant cry, his bloodied hands gripping the helm, his refusal to surrender. To them, Mehmed was proof that chains could be broken, that whips could be silenced, and that even on the endless sea, freedom was not beyond reach. Poets in hidden taverns set his name to verse, shaping him into more than a man. He became a symbol of resistance, a ghost who haunted the waters, a figure who reminded all who suffered that courage could outlive the flesh. Even those who never saw his face believed they could feel his presence in the salt air, hear his echo in the crash of the waves. And so, while the empire tried to erase him, Cara Mehmed remained etched not in records or monuments, but in memory. He had turned the sea itself into his legacy. Cara Mehmed left no chronicles, no written testimony, no grave to be honored. What he left instead was a story, an uprising born in chains, carried on waves, and sealed in blood. His rebellion may have been crushed, but it was not forgotten. He had transformed the very tools of his oppression into weapons. The oar that once broke his body became the rhythm of his escape. The chains that bound his wrists became instruments of revolt. The galley, designed as a floating prison, became for a brief, blazing moment a banner of defiance. History often remembers the victors, the rulers, the masters, but sometimes it remembers the nameless, too, the ones who refused silence. Mehmed's life was taken by the sea, yet in that same sea, his legend sailed on. Every wave that breaks upon the Mediterranean coast carries with it echoes of his defiance. He proved that even in the darkest depths of bondage, a man could rise, strike, and turn oppression into resistance. Cara Mehmed did not win his freedom, but he gave it form, however brief, and left it behind as a beacon. In the endless prison of the sea, he taught that freedom is worth the fight.